Welcome everyone, it's Neil here from 3D Tutor, back today with another complete guide. And in this one, I'll be showing you how I went from a simple Blender cube to this Wild West saloon in about 7 or 8 hours. But before we get started, like always, a quick word from today's sponsor. Yep, 3D Tutor, that's us, because we're not big enough to get some big sponsor to come along and support our work. But we do have something better than that, and that is our Patreon, where you'll find every guide we have ever done, complete with all the blend files, materials and textures. Now this is pretty standard across most Patreons, you may see out there, but here at 3D Tutor we want to do something a little bit different. In other words, we want to give you a whole lot more. This is because the more patrons we get, the more free stuff we can keep creating. In fact, if we get to around 150 patrons, we can hire another pro blender or Unreal expert to pump out even more quality content. And of course, free stuff on top of that. So what do we give here at 3D Tutor via our Patreon? Well, over 350 hours of complete courses. Every month, you'll get to choose a course and it will be delivered right to your email. And best of all, you can pick which course you would like out of our vast library of over 23 courses. And the courses aren't just on Blender. We have courses on Unreal Engine, Photoshop, ZBrush, and for sure you're going to find some Substance Painter courses in there as well. So please check us out over on our Patreon, links are down below. And of course, if you want to check out the model, especially have a good look round in all the nooks and crannies and things like that, then there is a Sketchfab link, as well as all the other links where you can download it and everything like that down below. Now enough of all that fluff, what you're here for is to see how I put this building together. So let's get started on our stylized Western saloon. Cheers everyone! Welcome everyone to the modeling section of the saloon, and the first thing we're going to do is bring in our OBJ human just to get a scale of how big this actual saloon is going to be. Next thing I'm going to do is actually work on the actual levels just to get an understanding of where my actual balcony is going to be and how it's all basically going to fit together. And then finally what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to bring in then a font for the actual saloon, you know, that I'm going to have on the front of it. It's important to get these things in first. I feel like you can actually build off of these. So when you're building something, actually get like a central point of what you're actually going to build off. And from that, then you can even get sort of the style that you're going to go for and things like that. Next of all, I'm going to actually work on the front. And what I'm actually doing here is I'm actually creating the planks. And this, we could have gone in and created all the planks with textures and things like that, but what I want to do in this build is create realistic looking planks. We could have even gone even further, took them into ZBrush, things like that, and you know, really roughen them up, but we decided in the end just to actually create a realistic plank without actual ZBrush and let the textures do the rest of the work. So it really actually brings out the model if you can actually do that. Now if we had more time, we could have gone over and actually retopologize them. That would have been a low to high workflow, baking them out and then taking them through to Substance Painter, but we didn't do that in the end just because we didn't have enough time. All right, so next I'm working on the windows and I'm trying to get a style. That's what I'm basically doing here. What style is this saloon going to be? Because if you look at saloons on Google or Sketchfab and things like that, they have many different styles. So we need to kind of fit the style that we're going to go for. Once I've actually got my window and the style nailed down, then I can actually create the doors, the building, the wagon, everything kind of to fit that style. You'll notice there that the actual window, although they're stylized, they're not really chunky stylized. So there you've got the kind of style that you're going for. All right, so now we're on to the saloon doors. And this is a simple thing where I'm basically going to insert with I once I've actually added the planks in, and then I'm just merging those two actual vertices together, as you can see, because they were causing issues. Next, I'm going to bring in a mirror, just to mirror it over the other side. Then what I tried to do is bring in a bevel modifier. Wasn't working, so what I did was I reset the transformations, then brought in the bevel modifier, and just making sure it actually works first when I'm bringing that in. You can see I've got problems with it, so I'll just take it off, fix whatever problems are, and then bring it back in. All right, so we're near enough pretty much done with the door. All I'm actually doing now is just shading smooth, bringing in my auto smooth. Blender's auto smooth is really good, so just doing that. And then what I'm going to do now, I think I'm going to actually boolean this in. So I'm just quick save out, boolean this in just to give me that kind of hole that I need there. And then I'm going to bring up just some wooden struts on there. The thing is, take this a bit of time. So you'll notice as I'm building this, same as all my builds, I'm going to create the front of it and then I'm probably going to bounce around somewhere else. That's what I do because then I'm thinking about the rest of the build as I'm, working on some part else. So the planks are pretty easy. All you want to do is you want to actually bring in some edge loops. You want to then bring in a marked seam and then you can select the islands very easily, split up the wooden planks, and then what you're going to do is just rotate them on individual origins and then bring in a bevel modifier. You can see there as well, I'm using the Boolean again because what I want to do is set those windows back. You'd be surprised how much more realism you're going to get if you actually set your windows back actually into the building. If you just stick them on the side, honestly, they don't look nowhere near as good as if they are actually set back. Now here what I'm doing is I'm actually creating the windows all together. As you can see there, I pulled them back once I'd actually put them in place because one of the hardest things on this build is actually working with angles. You're going to have to keep changing your local, your normal angles all the time just to make sure that you're getting the right angles to actually put things against it. You could use the snapping tool in Blender, but honestly, I find it actually quite hard to use the snapping tool, so I'm actually using just changing where the normals are and things like that. So you can see that I'm just trying to rotate these. I'm having a problem with them. So in the end, I think I actually rotate it back and then I rotate them and then I rotate it back and just did it that way because it was just a much easier way of doing it actually. You can see that I put the windows on normal. They were actually could go back then, but the problems arise when you actually have something, and if you don't reset your transformations before, and then you rotate it, Blender doesn't actually know where it is in real world space. So a bit of a mess up on my part there. All right, so now I've got my angles in of my actual side kind of walls, so the front of it basically. Now I'm going to work on is the actual bottom, not the balcony, where they actually walk out. So I'm going to work on that next. Again, I'm not carrying on making the rest of the walls. I'm going to start on that part, bouncing around again while I think about the rest of it. I'm also thinking actually in this, while I'm making this part, what am I going to put around the back? Because I really don't like it when people, they create buildings and it looks great from the front, but when you go around the back, there's like basically nothing there. I feel like if you want to tell a story and really bring your models to life, it's always worth thinking about what you're actually going to put around the back. So while I'm creating this, I'm actually thinking about that at the same time. Again, for this model as well, I got a ton of references for everything from wagons to windows to water towers and everything, mainly off of Sketchfab and Pinterest, and I use Pure Rev to actually put them on there. So I do also use Artstation, and we also use a little bit of Google, but they are the main ones that we actually use. And you can see there why I've got actual you can see I've got edge loops actually sideways as well. And the reason I have them in there, it gives me the ability then to go in with proportional editing and kind of raise those planks up, move them around with randomize on, and then it like really makes them look realistic for very, very little work actually. So that's why I've got those edge loops in the side. If I didn't have those there, I wouldn't be able to move them around so easily. So now we're just thinking about, as you should when you're building something like this, what is supporting everything? How much support does it need? Does everything look big enough to actually support it? In other words, if you don't want little twigs holding this thing up, it's going to be very, real big pieces of wood that are going to hold this thing together, because people are going to be walking, on top of it and things like that. So got to make sure it don't collapse. Plus, it's also, it's in the desert. Things, get eroded quite easily. So just something else to think about when depending on where you're building something. Now you can see that I'm actually coming to the second floor now. Rather than actually again finishing off the bottom floor, I'm bouncing around again, thinking about how I'm going to do this actual window at the top. I wanted it to be a certain style to fit in with that kind of theme I'm going for. And you can see I'm trying a few different things there, just not quite getting it. So in the end, I actually do something a little bit easier. So just grab those and I'm going to bring them in. And again, I'm going to have a few problems with this bringing them in. You can see that they're way too thick. So in the end, let's just bring in a cylinder and let's bring them out from that, and that is perfect way of doing it. So you can see that sometimes, I've got to play around with how I'm actually going to do this to give it the best look that I want, and that was the way that I came up with. So now you can see it's looking much, much better, and it was a really simple way of doing it. Don't be afraid. I know there's people who have commented in the comments and things like that of making meshes with, tons of different parts. Don't try and do meshes where they're, all joined. I don't know where this comes from, where people think that they need to make sure, meshes are entirely one mesh or something like that. You really don't need that. It's not going to help you even if you're sculpting, because you can send it through to ZBrush, you can Dynamesh it, and that joins it all together anyway. You can send it through to Substance Paint and you can paint it just as easily. The only problem you have with doing loads of separate parts is the fact that you're going to have a lot of wasted UV space. So as long as you go in, you optimize your models, making sure you've got rid of backs that, you're not going to need to paint or anything like that, it should be absolutely fine. So just make in as many parts as you want. It will really, not hinder you in any way, actually. All right, so now again, we've got the main saloon sign on there. And again, we have to think about how is this going to be supported? Is it going to be strong enough and things like that? And you'll notice in all of my builds, we tend to really focus down on is something, realistic? Is it realistically supported, basically? No matter if we're working on something realistic or if we're working on something stylized, the same thing should still apply. So it was a little bit tall there for my liking, because sometimes as well, when you're building these things and you've got the front on, once we have this front on now, it's much easier just to take a step back and look at everything, and then you can decide, right, is this too tall, or, because basically this second floor where the saloon actually is, you haven't actually got a height for it to go against, because basically it's the top floor and then added another bit on for that top roof part. So again, we're working with, weird angles. I think it was 37 degrees or something like that. It's always a good idea as well to write down what the angle is. It does help out. So let's say you want to put some windows now, bring them across, rotate them by 37 degrees, and there we go. They're going to line up perfectly. So just remember to do that. And again, always remember to set your transformations before actually continuing. The other thing is, when you're building something like this, have an idea of the scale. So what I mean by that is how much space have you got on the inside of there. If we make it really, really close together, those walls, there's not actually going to be any space to put a bar in there or anything like that. So just to have a good understanding of how much space is going to be in there. I do see a lot of models where it simply wouldn't be able to work with what you're actually trying to do. So just bear that in mind. All right, again, you can see me there adding edge loops, bringing in that proportional editing, putting it on to random, and then you can see that is the result perfectly there, what we actually get. Now you can easily mirror it over the other side once you've done that, because you're never going to see both sides, so they're not actually going to line up, which is really great, because that is the time when you can get away with your mirroring. Now for the front, you can't get away with mirroring so much when you're randomizing, because they are going to look the same, because you're going to see them both at the same time. So just something else to take into account. When you're doing roofs as well like this, always better off actually using the knife tool, because it's just simple. Just to bring it in, cut it to shape, that whatever shape you want, and then off of that you can actually create these platforms that I've actually created from them. Again, when you're creating anything like this, it really comes down to your workflow, because you want to create something like this within you want to get it down to a few hours actually is what you're aiming for. Because if you're creating something like this, like I do for YouTube and for people who are downloading the models and things, then you can kind of create it in, let's say, 5 to 10 hours, something like that. Now, if you're creating it for something like Overwatch or a AAA game or something, obviously there you're going to spend a lot longer on something like this, but you're already going to have the ability and the skills to actually get that workflow to a point where you can still create it in, let's say, 30 or 40 hours. Now, I'm only going to talk really about this one as we go through things that we've not actually talked about, so much and things like that. Now, again, with you doing something like the water tower, it does seem easy to just create a water tower. But again, just make sure you get tons of references in what a water tower would look like from this period, because a modern water tower and a Western style water tower, they will look completely different. So just, bear that in mind. Also, bear in mind when you're actually creating something, especially if you're the one doing the textures, just make sure that you are designing it in a way where you can actually apply certain textures. So for instance, on this one, there's no point me going in there and doing all the metal work because I know the textures are going to do a lot of the job for me. So here I'm working on the balcony, and as you can see, I brought up my guy there just to get a real idea of how high it needs to be. Basically, when you're creating a balcony, what you want to think about is a normal scaled human being walking up to it and being able to lean on it kind of with his elbows pressed on it. And you don't really want it any higher or any lower than that. So it's a really easy way actually to get a good scale of your balconies. You can see there when I brought that one out, that top one, and I bent it round, it actually made it a lot thinner, and that's not something that I actually want. So what I did was, instead of that, is I just brought up like one individual edge, and then what I did is I extruded that out and then used Solidify to actually bring that up then. And what that did was it kept the same actual width all the way around that balcony. And again, now you can see I'm bouncing backwards and forwards to different parts, and then I'll come back to the balcony in a bit, just making a couple of simple hinges here. Now the hinges, depending on where your camera is going to be. So for instance, if it was, a AAA game or something, and you are walking around this, then you want to actually take more time with the hinges and things like that. But being as this is a piece that is meant to be, viewed from a distance, not really, really close up, then we can get away with a lot more. So you can see I'm doing a simple kind of design for the wanted poster. I'm basically using the knife tool, cut it out, solidify it, and then you get that really, really nice result. And then just a pin, just pinning it to there. And again, as I'm doing this build, I'm thinking about things I can add in it, which is going to be storytelling. I always like to do that in all of my builds, as you've seen. And this is with no exception either. So having a coffin there and a wanted thing, sign on it, just telling a Western style story. And a lot of the time I get these ideas from when I'm actually referencing these things. I'm seeing a lot of these things actually in references. So for instance, if you do go on Sketchfab and you put in Western, you're probably going to get some wanted signs. You're probably going to get some coffins, things like that, some wagons and things. So you can actually add those to your references for ideas for storytelling. Now, the thing is, with most builds that you do, when you do buildings, the top windows are probably going to be different from the bottom windows. So just take that into account. It's always a good idea, even if they're not, to have, 3, 4 styles of windows and doors. So don't, make buildings where they've got just the same windows all the way around. It's not, I mean, it does happen in the real world, but it's not, even on the back of, let's say, a square mansion, for instance, where they have those, long windows in there, they will have them all the way around, but then the back, they'll have some patio windows or something like that. And also they might add the odd 1 or 2 different windows at the top that are round or something. So just bear that in mind. Don't use the same windows all the way throughout the build. You can see there again with those windows, I did boolean them in and bring them back so they actually fit in much, much better than if I just stuck them on top of the wood. It's also a good idea to learn to do that as well, because if you ever want to come back to this build and let's say you want to do the inside of it, then you've got the option to do that. If you haven't done that, then you're going to have to go around boolean all the windows, just to make sure that they are working so you can see inside and things like that. Now with this balcony, not balcony, roof here, I had to think like how I'm going to actually build it. And you can see in the end, I've got it there, but I'm not happy with it. I'm looking around and thinking this is just not working out very well. And it's the angle of the planks, as you can see, they just don't look right. So what I did was in the end, I brought in a new, you can see me bending it out there because it's just not right. So what I did was I just brought in a new plane and just basically redid it. So if you're not happy with something, it's not working out, just redo it. It just makes it so much better in the end. And you can see now, once I finish this, it does look so much better. And it was really worth me actually coming in and redoing it. Again, the same technique there. Make sure when you've got actual planks of wood where they actually have an end, just make sure that you again use the proportional editing with randomize and just pull the ends out a little bit. And it's going to make a whole difference to your actual builds for just really, really simple technique. And you can see again here, I'm thinking, how can this be supported? It's not just going to be supported with a couple of posts. It's going to have a little bit more to it than that, just to make sure you can distribute that weight a bit more evenly. All right, so now I think I'm actually going to come round to actually working on the sides. Yep, I am. So I've already thought in my head that I'm going to have, some kind of crane bringing in supplies and things like that. And the reason is I could have actually had this at the bottom. It would have made more sense, but it looks better at the top so you can have a crane on there lifting something into place. So I am aware that it could have gone in the bottom. But again, it's you have to take a balance between what's going to look good as well. So just think about that when you're storytelling. A lot of times when you're trying to tell a story, it turns out that it's not actually going to look as good as what it did on paper, for instance. So that's why I put it in the top. So the crane at the bottom, it doesn't look as though it's lifting something up, and it wouldn't need a crane in there. So also I wanted to actually put some, those kind of sliding train doors on the side, which is what I'm creating here, because I knew that would add a lot to the actual build. So to put those in, I need to think, well, why am I putting those there, and what else can I put there? And that's why I did it this way. Now, a little bit later, when I come to, complete the crane, I'm going to use a geometry nodes. And again, you can find these geometry nodes on our Gumroad. So there's a geometry node there with one of the other projects that we did. So just have a look at them and you'll see one where it's got a load of rope in there. I think it was the Viking ship actually with the geometry nodes. Yeah, it was the Viking ship. So if you want this geometry node with the rope, which you'll see soon, then just go and get the Viking ship one. The reason I'm saying that is because I'm not sure whether that rope geometry node is actually in this one. I don't think it is, so. And you can see I'm taking a lot of time on this part, just making it look realistic, like everything fits together properly. And also, you can also see that crane at the moment. If I kept it that size, it wouldn't be able to, bring the crates up and then move them around. So what I did was I just made it a little bit smaller, just to make it fit in a little bit better. And now it can turn around. The other thing is as well, I've got to actually create something that enables it to actually turn. Because if we don't have that, you can't turn a crane with just a piece of wood. So you have to have a turning mechanism. So just as well, bear that in mind. It can be really simple like this, but your eye naturally picks up something. If there's no turning point on it, even though you might not notice what it is, your eye will pick it up and it won't look quite right because it'll be like, well, that's a crane, but how are they going to get the actual crate into that actual space? Alright, so this is the geometry node that I was talking about. So I quickly just brought in that geometry node, and you can see what we can do with this is, first of all, we can move it wherever we want it. Whenever we extend that rope, it just basically adds more rope to it, so that's really nice. And the other thing is we can bring it in, mess around with it, and just drop them in, and then finally we can just convert it to actual mesh. So really, really easy when you've got something like that. And I do recommend like you build up your geometry nodes because they're just so useful. I think another, something else we'll put on YouTube is actually creating buildings and actually, using geometry nodes to create the floors and things like that, making them fully procedural. So that's something that, we're thinking about doing in the future. So. All right, so all I'm doing now is I'm turning down the amount of resolution on that geometry node because the thing is the rope is very, very high resolution. It will be thousands of polygons. Rope done like that would be that anyway. We could have got away with just using a curve or something like that, but then we decided to go for a little bit more realism. So now we're making the porch steps, and the thing is, again, I can't just have blocks there because they wouldn't just be blocks of wood. There'd be a little bit more than that. If they're just blocks of wood, they would be worn away really, really fast. So creating them like this fits in much, much better with the rest of the build. And again, I'm thinking about where do I want the other supports. Just adding a bit of ornamentation to them, just to make them look, kind of nice and fit in the scene really nice. And they're also there, obviously, for support. So now I'm going to the actual terrain here. So all I'm doing is just quickly messing it up like that. You can see sometimes when you dynamesh it, you will get holes in things and things like that. Just go in, use the inflate, smooth them off again, and then they should work out absolutely fine. Because it is a desert terrain, you don't really have to worry too much about, making sure everything looks nice and things like that because it's simply not what we're actually going for here. So now I'm trying to do is just get rid of that bottom. I know I'm not going to need it, so I'm just going to get rid of it. And you can see it turned out really, really nice from the actual thumbnail. All right, so now we're actually coming to the wagon. I've made tons of wagons. I've actually got a course on, painting a wagon and things like that. So wagons are pretty easily. It's, being kind of interested in medieval. It's something I've made a lot of. We also have the pumpkin carriage as well, which, is a course we put out there. So, if you go on our Udemy, check out the pumpkin carriage. It does look, it's very, very different to anything else you're going to see out there. The other thing is with the wagon, I need to make sure that it's the right size, basically. And you will always notice as well with wagons, most of the time, the front wheels are always going to be a little bit smaller than the back wheels. And that's because then it makes them a bit easier to turn. So just bear that in mind. As well, I always make sure that if I'm creating a wagon, I'm making sure that the axles on the bottom look as though at least they're fitting into something. Depending on, again, how much time I've got, or what sort of model it's going to be, I will take more time making sure the mechanism on the bottom is working, as it would do in a realistic wagon. On this one, what I've done is I've cut a few corners, I've brought the axle in, and I'm just going to actually use just a part just to kind of put it onto the bottom of this wagon. And that's what I'm going to do, as you can see. Quite a really easy technique. Just a plank of wood and a piece of metal, and then just bevel it off like so, and you can see it works really, really well. Again, pulling out those planks of wood makes all the difference, so make sure you do that. And now I'm going to do is just bring in some crates from one of our courses. It's the dungeon prop course, so we made some crates in there, and I've just brought them in by appending them from that blend file, and you can see these crates really, really nice. And because of simple crates, there's no problem as well to just retexture them for the actual scene. So I'm just making sure I'm doing that. Again, I'm using that actual rope geometry node. And you can see as well how easy it is, even with, all I did there is I got the cube and basically just brought in an edge loop, grabbed the edge loop round, and then just split that away from the rest of the cube and turn that then into a curve. So don't forget, you can also turn curves to mesh, but also you can turn mesh to curves as well. So make sure you make use of that if you're going to use things like, rope and stuff like that, because it makes it really easy. All right, so just a quick whiskey bottle or something like that here, just to make it as, look, even though it's a few more polygons, just adding that in there, if people are looking around there, it just really, really adds to the scene. So just don't forget about those. And now I think I'm creating, I'm just creating the cactus now. Really easy to create cactus. There's nothing to them. There's no branches. So just bring in a skin modifier and then just bring in a subdivision modifier. And there you go. You've pretty much got your cactus. Really easy. Let the texturing do the work on something like that. You can see that I had a bit of problems with that one down there. And all I did was I ended up going to vertex and smoothing it off. And it gave me a smaller cactus, which is actually, I wasn't looking for that. But in the end, I'm like, yeah, okay, that looks pretty nice. So it was a happy mistake. All right, so now round the back again, round this side, I'm going to tell another story in that there's a toilet around there. There's also going to be a trapdoor in there where they drop the barrels in for the, for the beer or whatever. And let's make a toilet around there. So again, it doesn't have to be much, but just having like, a plain back on there, it's a bit boring. So I just wanted to go a little bit further with it. Now, of course, if you really want to tell a story, you'd have an open door and you'd have an actual toilet there, and a lot more things in there. But again, it just depends how much time you've got. Now, also with this, because it is a smaller part, it's not the main part, I'm going to make sure that the textures can do the work. So, in other words, the planks of wood are going to be done, maybe not on this one, but on certain parts of the wood through textures. So you can actually go in Substance Painter, you can use the same texture, but what you can do there is you can add like lines on there, so you can actually make it look like wood, which you'll see actually in the texturing part of this. Again, another wagon. I think at this point I was a bit tired of doing wagons, but I didn't want to use the same wagon twice. I did want to make them look a little bit smaller. And the other thing as well is I thought this wagon's going to hold a lot of weight, so we just need to make sure, that it looks really, really sturdy. The other wagon looks as though it's more built for speed, getting crates and things like that there on time. Now you can see what I've done with this is, you can do this in Blender by the way, but I've just made a basic like outline for how I want the actual top of this to go, cutting that away, and then I'm going to send that through to ZBrush. But again, don't forget guys, you can do this in, in Blender. It's just that I've got ZBrush open and it's just so simple for me to just bring that in there and do it, actually in there. So I actually have a really good workflow of working between both of them. And I think if you can do that, it works really nicely. So very, very simple here. I didn't really take any time actually to do this because I knew, it was just the top of the wagon and I didn't really actually want to spend a lot of time sculpting and things like that. Not on this build. On the other build that you're going to see that's coming out, the Indiana Jones one, yeah, we spent a lot of time on sculpting that one. So most of that build is about sculpting. So that'll be coming out on the next video. So just keep your eye out for that one. Really, really cool, that one. It's going to feature a lot of animations, a lot of sculpting, a lot of, foliage, things like that. It's going to be pretty good. Now, again, you can see here, they're not quite in line, so I just pulled it across because I know, it's part of the wagon. It's not going to be perfectly, leveled out and things like that. It's going to be replace that seat and things. And I could have put some horses in this scene as well, but again, like I said, I didn't want to do a lot of sculpting, so, horse would have taken maybe a couple of hours to create that, so Probably would have looked good though, bringing a horse and putting it near the, where the water is and things like that. So. All right, so now we're moving on to the actual trapdoor. And again, you can see because we've just added those few assets around the back, it's really like brought the actual whole scene to life. All of these techniques now you will have seen all the way through the build. So if you are following along with this should be pretty standard to you at this point. The one thing we do different here is we just bring in some handles soon just to put on top of them. So you'll see how we do that as well. But a simple technique, just using curves. And there you go, that's how we did that. So bring in a circle, extrude the curve out, and that's it, simple as that. Now we are going to need some more handles, so I just test it out, I think, on the door. Then I decide in the end, yeah, it's just not going to look right after messing around with it. So I'll just create another door instead. But rather than do that right now, I actually created the place where you hold the horses against. So you wrap the stirrup round. And you can see how I pulled those out. Just all in the same length, mirrored them over, and there we go. And now we're working on the trough. Very simple to make the water. I basically just created a plane, added some edge loops, brought in displacement of clouds, and then just messed around with the contrast. And there you go. Simple as that. Just make sure you smooth it off though. You don't want those hard edges in there. Alright, so now I'm not sure actually if I actually created these as wood. Yeah, I think I actually did. No, I actually just left those. So I think we just painted the wood in on this one. I just brought that out so we can actually make it all line up. And also, don't forget, guys, if you are building this, just make sure that once you've actually got what you're happy with, make sure you're beveling them off. So you don't want your wood to be perfectly straight or anything like that. Also, make sure you turn cavities on as well. I did actually forget to say that. That is the option. You can see there, the top right-hand side, where you've got your... you've got your see-through mesh and you've got your normal mesh. If you click that little down arrow when it's on object mode, you'll have an option that says cavity. And when you turn that on, you'll see you're able to see your model much, much clearer. Now this rock here, I wanted it to be made of sandstone. So that's why it's, I've gone in and I've just used the clay build-up. And you can see this took, I think, like 10 minutes at the most or something like that. But the result is really, really nice. Now, the other thing about doing this in ZBrush is the retopology tools, the basic ones, are really easy to use. So you can see now I've got 2 of them. I'm going to pre-process it, decimate, pre-process it, decimate it, and bring it down to probably around, 3,000 polygons or something like that. This is the only one, by the way, where we used a high topology and low topology workflow. In fact, I think I got it down to 1,000 polygons actually. So a rock with 1,000 polygons, not that high. Grab them both together, bring them in, and there you go, there's the rock. So we've got a high and we've got a low and they're in the same place. And then when we send that through to Substance Painter, we just bake it off against each other and then we can paint all that detail in and things like that. Now you can see here I'm thinking about my other rocks. I could have brought some more sandstone rocks. This is the rock generator, by the way. This is inbuilt within Blender. So, if you need rocks, make sure you're using this. Just be sure to grab them all at the same time and convert to mesh. And what that'll do is it'll add all of those modifiers. You can see when you bring these in, there's a ton of modifiers on the right-hand side. So just convert mesh, convert them all at the same time, and then it'll be done. Remember though, the polygon count on the rocks is pretty high, so you might have to go in there and use another modifier just to decimate those down a bit. And if you build this way, by the way, honestly, the polygon counts, they shouldn't be that high, really. Yeah, it's probably higher than if you really wanted to make them really low. So if you're building this for a mobile game or something, you wouldn't have gone in there and made like the planks of wood separately, for instance. You would have let the textures do the work. So it is all about, what you want to see, how high res you want to see it, things like that. But really don't, if you're just building this, don't worry about polygon count too much. You can always go in and optimize it more anyway. So just build, and then when you've done it, check the polygon count. And if you're following this sort of workflow as well, it shouldn't be that high. You can see everything's pretty simple. It's the problem comes when you're adding loads of subdivisions in. You can really go overboard on the subdivisions. So just be careful using subdivisions if you're using that modifier. So simple rocking chair here. More storytelling. And I knew at this point, actually, I didn't have a lot of time left. So I knew that whatever I was creating, it had to be pretty fast. And honestly, when I built the animal skull on the next part, I was surprised how fast I actually created that. I think, this is it. This is the animal skull. And you'll see how well this actually turned out for just literally 5 minutes of work or something. So just get the basic shape, whatever you're doing, bring in your subdivision. Pretty much there you go. And then just a quick add in a curve, bring it round. And all I do is I grab the edges of those, I put it on proportion editing, I press Alt S, and what I'll do is it'll, bring it in to get that nice curve and those really thin bits on the end. So now you can see it just fits in really nicely there. And really adds to the actual scene. All right, so that's the end of the actual modeling part. I really hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned a lot from it. And now we're on to the actual texturing part. All right, everyone, so I'll see you on the next one. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
All right, now in order to start off the texturing process within the Substance Painter, I started up by loading up the model and just baked out ambient occlusion first in a low resolution just to make sure that I check the entire mesh in regards to how it gets baked off. And then afterwards, I just baked everything out in 4K, everything except for the rock that's in front of the cactus in front of the saloon. So with that being said, the rock itself had a high poly version of the mesh. So what I had to do basically, I just had to make sure I baked that out separately. So even though right now I'm baking all of the textures and you can see the rock being baked off as well, I just go ahead and replace those baked textures. So I wouldn't be just using low topology. I'd be able to make use out of the high topology and get some nicer details for the rock. And then smaller rocks, they didn't need that type of a detail, so they just had a simple low topology on them. But yeah, once I was happy with that, I started off by just getting a really basic type of a texture for the base of the scene, just so I could get a better grasp in regards to the texture of the rest of the environment. I just decided to leave that off as a last texturing process, since I wanted to kind of overlap some textures for them and get some grittier areas next to the building and whatnot. But we're going to come back to that in the end. So right now I just started off by getting myself a stylized wood material that I have, a smart material which makes use out of curvature as well as ambient occlusion, and has a very basic type of a wood grain going throughout an asset. And once I applied the entire smart material, I wanted to get a real nice kind of a combination of variations of a wood for this environment, for this scene. Since most of this environment is set up in a way that's actually just made out of wood, we had to make sure that we get a real nice variation and we just combine some colors as well as some other textures through them. So yeah, in order to get ourselves a nicer type of variation, I just got myself a simple overlay for green and white colors, and it made them look like they're painted out. And I think I removed some of that mask by using a curvature just to kind of make it look like the paint is being worn off. And once I was done with that, I realized that the entire grain for this type of environment is going to be rather tricky, because it turns out not only do we have a horizontal as well as vertical kind of going angles for the grain, we also have like those diagonal type of a wood going across, and that just complicated it for me a little bit, because I actually was just using a simple automatic UV unwrapped mesh, and what made it worse was actually I made use out of a nice add-on that packs up the textures even more. I needed to make sure I get a lot of resolution out of them, and by default Blender automatically UV unwraps the longer kind of UV chunks to be facing in a one way, which really helps out when you're doing like wood grain and whatnot, for example, as you can just quickly apply the entire texture in regards to that. But since I wanted to get more density out of this entire building, I just needed to make sure that I packed them up as tightly as I can, which only meant that I basically had to set myself up with triplanar projections in regards to the grain, the wood grain itself, which again was quite a complex type of a thing to do for this type of a scene, which had a lot of wood grain involved. But it took a while, but it ended up quite nicely in the end, so I was pretty happy with that. So moving on, once I was starting on with the other wood outside of the railing, for the base, for the floor, I used a different wood grain. I just made sure to overlay another material for the wood instead of using the default one. And I simply made use out of the same small material that I had set up, just to make sure that I have consistency throughout this entire scene. Then afterwards, as for the walls, I also made use out of the UV chunk color randomizer, which I made use in order to just get some more color variation out of those planks that you see within the scene. This was especially necessary for the walls because otherwise they would look too bland, and you got to make sure you make them look like they're set up with just different kind of planks and they're just manually built instead of just having that fake decorative type of a look. So yeah, to make it more natural, I just increased variation using UV color randomizer that you can get through the generator, and I just set it up with a mask, and that just helped me out in regards to that. And the rest of it, when I went on in regards to the roof, for example, I had to make sure I make use out of the same type of materials, the same type of textures that is within a different material, because I have those chunks set up in a different material packs. Luckily, this was rather easy because I was using triplanar projection. The scale for the wood grain, for example, would be stayed consistent throughout the entire scene. So I was easily able to duplicate the entire small material, and all I had to do was just make sure that they're positioned properly. The top of the roof also didn't have a lot of wood pattern in regards to the smaller walls, so I just decided to add additional pattern to that. And once I was happy with that, I moved on to other props. So for example, to the wood that's next to the horse drinking area, I wanted to make it a little bit more detailed, so I actually manually sculpted in some detail where, for example, the rope would be going around, just to make it look a little bit more worn off in regards to the entire pole. And once I was happy with that, I moved on in regards to creating smaller props. So for example, the coffin, I wanted to make sure I make it look really unique in regards to its poster, so I just manually kind of posted and stamped out some of the detail, and I set myself up with a really basic type of a stamp using Photoshop basically, and I created like a black and white type of a mask, which I was then able to apply it using a brush. And as for the text itself, you can actually make use within the Substance Painter of the font text that is provided by default, and within its details tab you can just change the text itself, and it's super easy to make use out of to get your custom writing in regards to the alpha stamps and whatnot. The downside of it though is that you don't have a lot of control in regards to how many fonts you can use. Luckily, I was able to find the right one for this Western type of a theme. So yeah, after that, in order to texture the sign itself, for example, again, I had to make sure I go with the consistency to set up the similar kind of textures, the colors, for example, the green border that goes around. But it wasn't too hard because all I had to do just make sure that the small material for the edge type of an edge wear for the color basically is just going to be automatically applied once I just copied out that small material. And yeah, moving on, in order to set up the nice type of a skull that we have at the front, it doesn't have a lot of detail in regards to its mesh, so I was trying to get more detail out of that. I was, for example, in regards to the bull horns, for example, I wanted to add a bit of a pattern that kind of spirals around itself, and it turned out quite alright in regards to the overall pattern. As I was using triplanar projection, I was experimenting a little bit more in regards to that with a spherical or cylindrical projection, but it didn't turn out quite as nice as I hoped for. So by using triplanar projection and lowering down the hardness, I was able to nicely blend in the overall pattern and make it look really nice in regards to that. And then I just overlaid a couple of additional textures, couple of colors, all of which I had to make sure that are triplanar projection, because again, I simply used the automatic UV unwraps in beforehand to set it all up. And yeah, basically to get all of the detail, I made sure I used the curvature as well as ambient occlusion. And sometimes I manually brushed out some of the detail, which made it look real nice. And to finish it off, I added some cracks to the skull, which made it look a bit old, and that just was perfect for the top of the saloon type of a building. And then afterwards, once I was happy with that, I moved on to texturing the water tower, which of course I had to make sure it looks quite aged as the sun would be constantly hitting it up and bleaching out its color. So I had to make sure that it is lowly saturated in regards to that. And as for the pattern itself, in order for it to go around the water tower, I just made use out of the projection, but this time instead of using triplanar projection for the texture, I made use out of the cylindrical projection and made sure that it is centered to the center of the tower itself, which turned out pretty nicely. And once I was happy with that, I moved on to texturing the backside a little bit as well. So in regards to the crane that we have, the one that is picking up the crates and whatnot, to get that look, nice kind of a look for the metal, for example, I made use out of a stylized metal that I had, which is primarily basically using the edge wear mask in order to break off the edges and kind of highlight them a little bit. And also it has a bit of an overlay for the roughness, but other than that, it is basically a real nice type of a material for a metal, for a stylized environment. So even though we're making more of a gritty type of a look, I think I actually did end up increasing the contrast for some of the masks within that metal, just to make sure it fits it more in regards to that type of a look within the scene. And yeah, once I was happy with that, in order to set up the ropes, for example, because there were two separate meshes, I was able to mask out one piece as well as the other piece and kind of differentiate the knots in between basically and get a real nice type of a look for that texture of a rope. Then once I was finished with that, basically I moved on to texturing crates. Now in regards to the crates, by the way, I totally forgot to mention that I am using a pure ref, which is really helpful in regards to getting some nice references. So the ones that I got, for example, are like a burnt out type of a wood. So to get that, of course, as a base, I made use out of the stylized wood that I had set up previously. And I was playing around a little bit with the overlays, with the gritty type of textures, just to get that burned out look. And of course, I changed up the roughness value a little bit, just to make it look a little bit more dried out, whilst still having that roughness variation. So when the light hits differently, it's still going to give us a lot of nice detail onto that dried up type of a wood. And yeah, afterwards I realized I needed some glass for the bottles inside of a crate, so I ended up just quickly adding that look using a smart stylized glass that I had set up previously. Since of course we got to do that because we always need to make sure we check how we can speed up our workflow, and basically if we have already a material that we can use, we might as well make use out of it. So we wouldn't need to just create it from scratch. But yeah, I just simply readjusted some glass variation. The glass itself needs to be a little bit metallic in order to give the right kind of a glossiness. Otherwise, it looks quite plasticky. So whenever you're working with glass, make sure to set it to either like 0.7, 0.8, something of that sort of a value. And then to get some color variations, I recommend you getting some overlay of a mask with a bluish tint, even though you're going to make it more of a green type of a glass, for example. That bluish tint is going to give us a really nice type of a reflection. And then finally, of course, the curvature masks, for example, we're going to make sure we use them to highlight the edges of those bottles. And yeah, once we were done with that, I also made use out of a cork material to just kind of get it applied on top of them, which was a really simple type of a material with some spotty type of a grunge mask applied on top of it. And just I used the height in order to kind of bring up the bumpiness of that texture, and it turned out quite all right. So in regards to texturing the wagon right now, I'm just again making use out of the same kind of wood that we had previously. I didn't want to have a bit more variation, so I think I actually added up just kind of overlaying some of the original materials that I had. But as for the barrels, for example, since they were pretty much the same as the crate, I was pretty confident that by using those type of materials, it would turn out quite alright. So all I had to do was basically just make sure that the mask is set up properly. Now, as for the wagon wheels, for example, that was a bit more interesting since I had to make sure I apply a sort of a ring around them but I didn't want to just make use out of a mask in order to cover the entire wheel, the circumference of the wheel. So what I ended up doing is I ended up making use out of a bevel filter within the mask, and that allowed me to kind of bring in that masking a little bit closer from the edge, and it made it look like it's just applied on top of the wood instead of just kind of stuck on the side of it. And then of course I made use out of the height map in order to bring up the intensity of the bump values, and it made it look like they're actually properly attached to the wheels basically, and it looked quite nice. I quite liked the end result of that. So yeah, moving on, in order to set up the attachment bits for the building, like the back toilet for example, or the rooftop door, I just had to make sure, again, I make sure again there is some consistency to the entire values, to the texture, but since the entire thing is made out of wood, it's not going to stand out as much if I just have it the same color. So I just had to make sure, for example, I was thinking in regards to the sun, how much it would be bleaching out the color values and whatnot. So the bottom section of the structure, for example, the bits for attachment, I made sure that they have a bit more saturation, and in comparison to the ones attached at the top, where they would be constantly exposed to the sun, I made sure to give them a bit less saturation and make them the entire material a bit lighter color. And yeah, once I was happy with that, of course, we had to continue on with regards to the grain. By having this project, I realized that maybe I should have tried out using Udemy, but the reason is that we're not using Udemy as much is because we're also setting them up, these type of scenes, for Sketchfab as well. And that would mean that we'd have to basically bring it back from Udemy and just set up the materials again, which would be a lot of extra work for us. So I'd rather just spend a little bit more time in regards to the wood grain and whatnot, and get myself some nice selection of materials to use, and so I could reassign them afterwards. And as for the Unreal, for example, we can make use out of the Udemy using virtual textures. But again, since I haven't used it in this occasion, in this environment, I'm not going to talk too much about it, not going to go too much into it. So moving on, in regards to the windows, when I was creating those window glass panels, I had to make sure when I was reusing the same type of a stylus glass that I actually used for the bottles, I had to make sure all of the grunge masks and all of the dirt is being applied properly in regards to its scale. So I had to kind of scale it down a little bit, and also as for the edges, to highlight those edges to kind of get that dust, I made use out of a nice reference, of course. And I wanted to break apart the mask a little bit, which in order to do that, I used the warp tool, and that helps us to just kind of get some more variation out of a mask when we needed. And then I was using overlay as well to kind of get ourselves even more of a masking detail type of grittiness that would be applied for the edges of the glass. And once we were done with that, I went ahead and continued on the texturing process with regards to the outside type of props, the rocks, the cactus. So as for the rocks, I had to make sure that we get ourselves a real nice reference, and we get ourselves some nice orange type of a rock. Of course, since it is a stylized type of a scene, I made sure to kind of get them a bit more extra, that type of a highlight for the edges, for the crevices and whatnot, which I think all in all turned out quite alright. So I was pretty happy with that. Then as for the smaller rocks, I think I added additional like grunge variation, since they were small, tiny rocks. Even if they were small, we still had to make sure that there's enough detail within them. Otherwise, they would have looked too plain. And yeah, once I was happy with that, all we had to do is just go around, make sure that we have everything set up, make sure that the consistency in regards to the wood pattern, for example, the scale is quite all right. So for example, for the top section of that attached piece of the building, I had to make sure I lower down the pattern a little bit, and we'd get ourselves some nice results. As for the toilet sign, I kind of applied it a quick stamp, but to get more variation, what I tend to do is within the color, I just get more color variation by getting a simple cloud noise type of a texture, and that turns out to be really quite nice often, as it makes it look like, even though it was like somewhat stamped in, some of the detail, because of the wood grain, for example, wouldn't quite have made it in regards to its burned out type of a texture. So some bits would be darker, some bits would be lighter, even though the height map would still be consistent and it would be bumping in that type of a sign. So moving on to get myself a cactus, I was actually pretty worried. I was a bit nervous in regards to that because the shape was a really type of a stylized and I wanted to get myself a more gritty type of a look. So I wasn't sure I'm going to manage that, but it actually ended up quite all right. What I ended up doing is I got myself some wavy lines and I applied it with in regards to the triplanar projection and overlaid them one on top of another. And then I also overlaid some spots which made them look like some small tiny spikes, which is exactly what we want within this occasion. Then afterwards I made use out of the same wavy lines. I just duplicated the layer, blurred it out a little bit, and actually just heightened up the normal the height values, basically the height channel values, which made it look like there's more detail within this type of a cactus. Then afterwards the bottom bit needs to be a bit wider in regards to that, to the cactus itself. So I made sure I apply a material texture on for that. And as for the detail itself for the cactus, I realized it still doesn't quite stand out. It still looks quite plain. So what I ended up doing it to fake that extra detail is I ended up using a light generator for a mask, and that just allows us to kind of mask out a certain direction based on kind of a sun rays, let's say. And this way I was able to kind of darken one edge of the cactus and make it look like it has a bit more depth to it, basically a bit more stylized, gritty type of a look. So once I was happy with that, in regards to the terrain itself, I actually had two seamless materials, and since it is part of the mesh, it's not a terrain or anything in itself, I was able to just kind of texture it out within Substance Painter to get a good result. So I overlaid both of them manually, kind of painting in the detail, and I made sure that the texture that had more of a dirt look is being applied for where the people would be walking by, for example. So we got to consider, we got to basically consider those kind of stuff when working with terrain, what kind of a situation to be exposed to, and like if there's like water drain or whatnot, and if we need to get more variation, for example, within it. But since this is a desert scene, I wanted to make sure that it looks like it's in the middle of nowhere, like kind of plains, kind of fields. So I just didn't work too much into it. I just had to make sure it makes it look quite nice in regards to highlighting the entire building, the structure itself. And then afterwards, as for the signs, like window signs, a whiskey, kind of a stamp on the box, or like the food stamp, I just made sure that I apply those kind of stamps and just get a bit of that extra detail from within this structure. And I think all in all it turned quite alright. As for the windows though, it was a bit more complicated because we had the glass in between the frames, so I had to make sure that they go in between them. But the alpha that I had, which I created by Photoshop with just simple text, I wanted to get a nicer font. It didn't quite fit right in between the frames, so what I ended up doing is just I kind of stamped out on one end, on one window, the first three letters, and then on the other piece of a window I stamped out the second piece of the letters and kind of deleted the bits in between. And I think it turned out quite nicely. And all in all, I quite like this project. It was a really nice working with. Everything except for my mistake for sorting out the UVs. I should have spent more time in regards to that, which I reckon costed me a lot of time to fix it all up. But once I was finally done with it all, I was basically exporting everything out in 4K resolution and was basically ready to go on to the Unreal Engine 5 stage. Alright, welcome to the Unreal Engine 5 part of the video. And in order to start out this project, I just got myself into the basic third-person template and just created myself a new level just to make sure I start fresh. Then afterwards, I basically was using a new project of Unreal Engine, a version 5.1, I believe, which was still in the preview state. And then I just imported everything in. And I was trying to speed up my workflow in regards to reassigning the textures and in regards to exporting out the textures from the Substance Painter. So what I was trying to do at the very start was actually just convert the OpenGL type of a normal map to DirectX normal map, because usually Blender would make use out of the OpenGL, and Unreal Engine is using DirectX normal maps, and that all that means is basically is the green type of a value channel inverted. So I was trying to set up a material for that, but in the end it didn't quite work out as I liked. I was also getting some errors during this stage, and I was trying to figure out what is going on with this entire mesh, since even though I was assigning and changing up the textures, it was still giving me a really bizarre type of a roughness value throughout this entire project. So even after I was changing up the texture for the normals and I was actually properly importing in the DirectX without trying to convert it within the material, it was still giving me a bizarre results. And upon further inspection, I looked into the mesh itself and I realized it wasn't actually the right type of mesh. It was giving me like an LOD type of a version. I tried to re-import in the FBX file from Blender, and I was actually importing it back into Blender just to see if the FBX is looking quite nice, but for some reason it was giving me a really kind of a simplified version of the mesh itself, and I wasn't sure what's going on. But as you can see, sometimes in my version of Unreal Engine it says that I'm missing some shaders. So what I had to do, basically I had to go into the project settings itself, and within the platform Windows tab, I just had to make sure I enable the DirectX 12, all of the shaders within it. And then when I imported in the mesh, I just got everything was basically fine. So I was pretty happy with that. But yeah, afterwards, even so, I still ended up changing them all to DirectX within my Unreal Engine for the materials, just to make sure that it directly is applied onto the mesh. And once I was happy with the basic assign, of course, I had to make sure that I got myself a water material as well. So even though the texture that I have kind of has some fake reflections within the water, just to make it look a little bit more stylized, I can't just simply turn on the opacity. I have to get some refraction within it. So by making use of a simple setup for material using a Fresnel, you're able to create an index of refraction that gives you a really nice type of a value for the water. And once I was done with that, I started playing around with the setup, with how I'm going to want to present this entire environment within the scene. I started off by just taking the clouds. I wanted to make it look quite simplistic and basic in regards to that. So I took off the clouds, I took off the sky sphere, and there is a skylight which by default tries to use the real-time kind of reflections, but because there was nothing within that area, I just had to make sure that the skylight is set up with a skybox. So I just turned off the real-time reflections and basically changed it to a cube map. And then afterwards, I wanted to get some more bit of an extra detail out of this type of environment. So I made use out of the Quixel bridge to set up some bushes, just real quick, kind of shrubs and whatnot. And I realized that I kind of want to make use out of them to create a tumbleweed within this, and I found myself a simple type of a bush that was going outwards and make it look like almost like a half a circle. So I just combined both of them together, added a couple of extra shrubs to this bowl basically, and just combined the mesh using the modeling mode. So it gave me a brand new type of a static mesh. Then afterwards, I played around with the texture values itself. I lowered down the saturation and increased the brightness to make it look like those shrubs have been bleached out by the sun a little bit more, to make this entire environment just look just a little bit more of a dried up type of a deserty look. Then afterwards, I wanted to add some bit of a motion to this scene. So I ended up playing around with Niagara particle system and just was trying to get it to kind of flow those tumbleweeds across this entire scene. Of course, the way that I was doing is basically I was trying to set it up so it would be bouncing on the bottom section on the foundation of the map and just continue moving on slowly to the side. But what I realized that the default terrain, it didn't quite bounce off those shrubs quite as nicely. So I ended up just getting myself an additional type of a mesh underneath. I just hid in it. I just made sure to make use out of a collider for it. Looking back at it though, I should have maybe set us up with a more simplistic type of a collider for those tumbleweeds, because what I noticed that sometimes they end up getting stuck on the ground itself, and if I would have had a simple spherical type of a collider, they would have just kind of rolled over a little bit more, I reckon. And in regards to that, when they kind of touch the terrain itself, I just kind of had to make sure that not only does it kind of stop it or like makes it drag across so it wouldn't go under the platform, so it wouldn't kind of float underneath it. I also had to make sure that it gives it a bit of more of a bounce to make those tumbleweeds more realistic. So I added a collider, and I just made sure that whenever it touches the collider, it just kind of bounces off from it a little bit, and it turned out quite all right. And just to make it a bit more organic, I also added a bit of a frequency noise, and that turned out quite well. Of course, I added a rotation to this as well, so all in all it would look like there's a proper motion within them. Now, the only thing that I had to do was just think of how they're going to appear and disappear. By default, there's going to be based on a timer. So of course, it wouldn't look quite as nice once they just disappear straight away. So I ended up just quickly adding a type of curvature that makes them appear from a tiny size, and then they disappear into kind of nothingness as well by shrinking upon themselves. And that just makes it look so much nicer in regards to the particles, I think. And yeah, once I was done with that, once I was happy with it all, of course, we had to set ourselves up with how we're going to have the cameras, how we're going to present this entire scene. So for example, usually I like to start off by getting the main shot done. I had to consider the angle, the main angle that we're going to have this out. And I found that the right side type of an angle was the best, since we had a shot of a wagon and as well as the front section of the saloon, which is the main type of a piece for this 3D environment. And then afterwards, of course, we set ourselves up with a turntable, which turned out pretty nice. But if you are setting yourself up with that, you just gotta make sure that you change the interpolation between frames to be from automatic to linear, just to make sure that the speed is consistent in regards to how the camera goes around the asset. And once I was happy with that, I get myself a nice transitional shot to get between those video parts, just to kind of spice up the entire complete guide. Which within it, you also got to consider like what is being overlaid. So because those transitional shots are going to have a title appearing, I just make sure that there's motion at the very start and it kind of stops after it reaches a certain point within the camera. And to finish it off, of course, I got myself a couple of close-up shots just to kind of highlight more of that additional detail using the video shots. And the main ones I was trying to highlight was the coffin, the area with a coffin and a wagon, then the left side as well, where it shows that nice cactus as well as a water tower. And finally, the back side for the crane and whatnot. I think all in all, it turned out quite all right. And then to finish it off, I got myself a quick renderer preset, which has a basic type of anti-aliasing and some additional settings to help us get the right type of results, like warm-up type of shots, for example, just to make sure we don't get some glitches in between the renders. And yeah, the main thing was just to make sure that the naming is set proper. Since they're going to be exported out as images, I had to make sure that my editing software is going to be able to pick them up and set them out as a video.